Jacob Miller was 17 years old when his childhood ended. It did not end slowly or with long arguments. It ended in a short conversation that lasted less than 5 minutes. He was told to leave the house that same day. There was no backup plan and no place prepared for him to go. He packed a small bag, took a few clothes, and walked out with almost no money in his pocket. Jacob did not come from a rich family, but he believed home was permanent. That belief disappeared the moment the door closed behind him. At 17, he had no land, no tools, and no skills that anyone respected. He had no savings worth mentioning and no clear future. Most people around him assumed he would fail. Some said it openly. Others simply stopped caring. The first weeks were about survival, not ambition. Jacob took whatever work he could find. He cleaned barns filled with dust and manure. He carried grain bags until his shoulders burned. He fixed fences in cold wind for farmers who paid him in cash and sometimes with leftover food. The work was hard and the pay was small, but it kept him alive. At night, Jacob slept in a small rented room behind a storage building near the edge of town. The walls were thin and the heater barely worked. Winters were long and quiet. Many nights he lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering how fast his life had fallen apart and how slowly it seemed to move forward. Every morning, Jacob walked the same road to work, and every morning he passed a scrapyard filled with broken machines. Rusted combines, bent plows, and old tractors sat there like forgotten memories. One tractor always caught his eye. Its paint was faded almost to gray. One tire was flat. Oil stains darkened the dirt beneath it. No one ever looked at it twice. For weeks, Jacob passed the tractor without stopping. He told himself it was useless. He did not need more problems. He needed stability. But something about it stayed in his mind. It looked worn, ignored, and discarded. It felt familiar. One afternoon, after a long day of work, Jacob finally asked the scrapyard owner how much the tractor cost. The man barely looked up before answering. $100, if you can move it. Jacob did not respond right away. $100 was almost everything he had saved in months. That money was meant for rent, food, and emergencies. Spending it on a broken tractor made no sense. That night, Jacob could not sleep. The number stayed in his head. $100. The tractor did not run. Parts were missing. Everyone knew it was junk. Buying it would mean risking everything he had left. Not buying it would mean continuing the same struggle with no clear way forward. When people heard what Jacob was considering, they laughed. Some told him directly that it was stupid. Others shook their heads and said nothing. The tractor did not even start. The engine knocked loudly when turned by hand. It looked like a mistake waiting to happen. But Jacob did not see a tractor. He saw time. He saw effort. He saw something he could work on instead of waiting for help that never came. He saw a chance to control something in a life where he controlled almost nothing. He bought it. Getting the tractor home took an entire day. Jacob borrowed chains from a neighbor and slowly towed along back roads. Cars passed by, drivers staring and shaking their heads. He felt embarrassed, but he kept going. When he finally parked the tractor inside an empty shed on rented land, he stood there silently for a long time. That tractor was not transportation. It was commitment. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest Jacob had ever faced. He worked during the day and repaired the tractor at night. His hands were always dirty. Cuts and burns covered his fingers. He borrowed manuals from libraries and listened carefully to older farmers who remembered machines like this when they were new. Some nights, nothing worked. The engine refused to turn. Other nights, it ran for a few minutes and died. Jacob questioned himself constantly. He wondered if everyone else had been right. He wondered if he had wasted his last chance. But quitting would have meant admitting that his life really was over at 17. Slowly, piece by piece, the tractor began to change. Cracked hoses were replaced. Filters were cleaned. Timing was adjusted. It was not pretty, but it ran. Not perfectly, but enough. That was when Jacob realized something important. He did not need the tractor to be impressive. He only needed it to work. And that understanding marked the end of his survival phase and the beginning of something different. From that moment, Jacob stopped thinking only about getting through the week. He started thinking about building something small but stable. The tractor was still weak and unreliable, but it worked well enough to take on light jobs. That was all he needed. Jacob began telling people he could help. Not big farmers and not large operations. He went to small landowners, elderly farmers, and people with fields that others ignored. He offered to plow, clear brush, and haul scrap metal. He charged less than anyone else, not because he wanted to compete, but because he needed the work. The first few jobs were rough. The tractor overheated often. Belts slipped. Bolts came loose. Sometimes it broke down in the middle of the field, and Jacob had to fix it right there with basic tools and borrowed parts. People watched him closely. Some shook their heads. Others waited, curious to see if he would quit. He did not quit. Each breakdown taught him something new. He learned how to listen to the engine, how to feel vibrations, and how to spot problems before they became failures. He learned patience, because rushing repairs only made things worse. Slowly, the tractor became more dependable, and so did he. The money was still small, but it was steady. Jacob saved every dollar he could. He tracked expenses carefully and avoided debt completely. When something broke, he fixed it himself instead of paying someone else. When parts were expensive, he waited and bought them used. Life was still simple. His room was still cold in winter. His clothes were still worn. But his days had structure now. He woke up with purpose and went to sleep knowing he had earned the next morning. Over time, people started calling him again. Not to laugh, but to ask if he was available. Word spread quietly that Jacob showed up when he said he would and finished the job no matter how long it took. He did not talk much. He did not make excuses. He just worked. By the time he turned 20, Jacob was no longer invisible. He was still poor, but he was respected. Farmers trusted him with small tasks, then larger ones. He learned how land worked, how seasons shifted, and how timing mattered more than speed. One year, after careful planning and saving, Jacob leased his first small piece of land. It was not impressive. The soil was tired, and the field was uneven, but it was his responsibility, and he treated it seriously. He worked that land early in the morning and late into the evening, using the same tractor that everyone once laughed at. The work was slow, and progress was quiet. But something important was happening. Jacob was no longer surviving. He was building. When he was 24, he bought a second tractor. It was still old and still unfashionable, but it was reliable. Buying it felt different. This time, it was not a risk. It was a decision backed by years of discipline. People noticed the change. They stopped joking about his past. They started speaking about his work. The boy who had been kicked out at 17 was becoming someone others depended on. Jacob did not grow fast. He grew carefully. While others borrowed money to expand quickly, he waited. While others chased bigger machines, he focused on efficiency. He knew what rushing had cost people before, and he refused to repeat their mistakes. Each year added something small. More work, better tools, a stronger reputation. He learned when to say no and when to wait. He learned that stability mattered more than appearance. The tractor that started everything was still there, running steadily and doing its job. It reminded Jacob every day that progress did not come from luck or shortcuts, but from showing up and refusing to stop. And without realizing it, Jacob had entered the most important phase of his life, the phase where discipline quietly turns effort into results. That phase lasted longer than Jacob ever expected. Years passed without anything dramatic happening. There were no sudden breakthroughs and no moments where life instantly became easy. Progress came slowly, one season at a time. Some years were good, some were hard, but none were wasted. As Jacob moved into his late 20s, he began to understand something many people never learn. Growth did not come from pushing harder every day. It came from knowing when to push and when to wait. He watched other farmers around him take on heavy loans to expand quickly. New machines arrived. New land was leased. Bigger risks were taken. Some succeeded. Many did not. Jacob chose a different path. He expanded only when he could afford to. When prices were high, he saved. When prices fell and others panicked, he stayed calm. He kept his costs low and his expectations realistic. He never forgot what it felt like to have nothing, and that memory kept him disciplined. Land came slowly. One small field became two, then another. Each piece of land was treated with care. Jacob learned its soil, its limits, and its strengths. He rotated crops carefully and repaired equipment before it failed. He avoided shortcuts, even when they looked tempting. The original tractor was still there. It had been repainted once, then again. Parts had been replaced many times. It was louder now and slower than newer machines, but it still worked. Jacob kept it running not because it was efficient, but because it reminded him of who he was when everything began. There were difficult years. Weather ruined crops. Equipment failed at the worst times. Some nights Jacob sat alone wondering if all the effort was worth it. He thought about how easy it would be to borrow money, buy new machines, and move faster. But he also remembered how quickly debt had destroyed others. So he stayed the course. By his mid-30s, Jacob reached a point few people expected. He owned his land outright. There were no loans, no bank pressure, no one calling to demand payment. His work supported him fully, and it did so without stress. He had something rare, control. His life remained simple. He lived in a modest house. He wore the same kind of work clothes he always had. He drove an old truck that ran well enough. He did not try to look successful because he no longer needed to prove anything. People in town began to speak about him differently. Younger farmers asked him for advice. Older ones respected his patience. Some called him successful. Others called him rich. Jacob never corrected them. Labels did not matter anymore. What mattered was peace. The tractor that had started everything still sat in one of his sheds. It was no longer used every day, but it was maintained carefully. Sometimes Jacob would start it just to hear the engine run. The sound reminded him of long nights, cold mornings, and the discipline that carried him forward when nothing else did. Years later, the scrapyard where he had found the tractor was gone. New buildings stood in its place. Most people had forgotten it ever existed, but Jacob had not forgotten. That place marked the moment his life changed direction. Being kicked out at 17 did not break him. It stripped his life down to the basics and forced him to build carefully. Buying the cheapest tractor did not make him rich. It taught him responsibility, patience, and respect for time. Jacob understood something simple that many never do. Wealth was not about speed. It was about control. It was about sleeping without fear and waking without debt. It was about building a life that could withstand bad years without collapsing. The tractor was old. The story was quiet, but the result was permanent. Everything changed, not in a moment, but over years of steady effort. And that was exactly why it lasted. Jacob was no longer trying to prove anything to the world. By the time he reached his 40s, his life had settled into a quiet rhythm. The days were predictable, the work familiar, and the pressure minimal. That was exactly how he wanted it. He had spent enough years living with uncertainty. Now, stability mattered more than expansion. He continued farming, but at his own pace. He chose his work carefully and turned down opportunities that would have required debt or unnecessary risk. People sometimes question why he did not grow faster or buy newer machines. Jacob never explained himself. He had learned that not every decision needed justification. The land provided what he needed, not excess, but enough. Enough to live comfortably, enough to plan ahead, and enough to handle bad seasons without fear. He reinvested quietly, repaired what he owned, and avoided waste. The habits he learned when he was poor never left him, even when he no longer had to live that way. The old tractor remained part of his life. It stayed in a separate shed, clean and maintained, even though it was rarely used. To anyone else, it was outdated equipment. To Jacob, it was history. It represented the moment he stopped waiting for help and started taking responsibility for his future. Sometimes young farmers visited him, curious about his path. They expected advice about money or machines. Jacob usually spoke about patience instead. He told them that speed was dangerous and that debt had a way of stealing sleep long before it stole land. He never pretended his path was easy. He only said it was steady. As years passed, Jacob became a quiet reference point in the community. When people argued about risky decisions or fast growth, someone would mention his name, not loudly and not often, but with respect. He never sought attention, and he never needed recognition. In the end, Jacob understood that success was not a single moment or a dramatic turnaround. It was a result of thousands of small choices made correctly when no one was watching. Being kicked out at 17 had forced him to face life early, but it had also given him clarity. The cheapest tractor he bought did not change his life by itself. What changed his life was the discipline it demanded and the patience it taught him. Everything else followed from that. His story did not end with wealth or fame. It ended with control, peace, and a life built carefully from almost nothing. And that was enough.